Hi, I'm Gary, the old geek guy. And normally I do videos on computer, iPad, and also some watches, iWatches, and things like that for people who are my age who don't get involved a lot in electronics and also digital and so on and so forth. But today I'm going to go a little bit different direction. I want to present this video that was taken from my mom back in 2005. It was a student at Cal State Fullerton who was doing a documentary on Rosie the Riveter. Now, that term, Rosie the Riveter, was actually talking about, or a term that was used for women who were on the home front during World War II. And not only were they home bodies, but they were also workers in factories for producing war machinery, and that was what my mom did at Lockheed for several years during World War II. Now, my dad was not home because he was in the Merchant Marines. He couldn't be in the regular military because they called him 4F, but he did want to get into the war effort somehow, and so he got into the Merchant Marines and loved it to death. He was on the European theater, which included mostly work on a hospital ship, and then when he got through that, he was on the Pacific Theater, and in the Pacific Theater, he towed a wooden boat that was going to be used for inter-island connections in the Philippines, in that area. He towed it from California on another very small boat all the way across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippines. They didn't use the boat because the war ended too soon, and so the boat was just kind of, I guess, put in mothballs and never used again. But anyway, that was my dad's work. But my mom, that's what we're really concerned about. And she's going to be talking about how or what it was like on the home front for women who had to work in factories and also bring up a family. Please listen very carefully to my mom. It's back in 2005. She was 88 years old. She did not speak well. She had a hard time expressing herself sometime. But if you listen very carefully, you'll hear some things about World War II you probably never knew about here in California, in the Los Angeles area where she lived as well too. Now, at the very end, she talks about my sister and myself being 2 and 4 years old at the end of the war. Wasn't quite right. I was born in 1941. The war ended in 1945. So I was probably 4 years old. My sister's 2 years older than me. That makes her 6 years old. So that's a little bit of a change. I've also had to cut off a lot of the introduction to this interview because I'm sure it's music that YouTube would not allow me to put on because it's Glenn Miller and several of the songs and also the orchestrations of the World War II sounds and also songs. So I had to cut that out just in case. I didn't want to get this eliminated or at least taken down off of YouTube. At any rate, I hope you enjoy it. Please watch it to the end. They do show the credits at the very end, and I want those to go through as well because they really deserve a lot for what they did about my mom. They did an excellent interview. Anyway, let's see how it goes.
Just what was normal for girls of that period. Got married when I was 18. And we moved to Burbank because there was a good deal on housing out there. It was real cheap. And so it was cheaper than paying rent, actually. So we got a place out in Burbank. It was a half an acre, a huge piece of land. And it was all weeds. A little flimsy house built on all weeds. We put in 4 lawns before we finally got one that was relatively weed-free. Yes, as soon as the war started, he went over and enlisted. I remember I was kind of provoked because he had a wife and a child and he wouldn't have been taken, but he said he felt like it was a thing he had to do. So he joined the merchant seamen, and he was taken right away. Well, the house was more than I could manage by myself, so I sold it. Moved in with my folks. Now that's what most of the girls did in those days, was to move in with their folks when their husbands went off. I always liked being a homebody myself. I liked to keep house and I liked to cook and I liked yard work, so I was very happy at home. Just considered practically unpatriotic for you not to be working. And besides that, Jim decided we needed the money at home too for some things we've been needing. I don't know. Just seemed like the proper thing to do was to go to work. Everybody worked almost. If you didn't work, you were home taking care of somebody's children so they could work. Most of the mothers took care of the kids. My mother took care of my two and my brother's two. She had 4 little children, and all of them about between 2 and 6. I think she had the hardest job of all. Lockheed was hiring. Went down and applied one day, and they called me the next day to come down and start work. No, I don't remember any special training of any kind. They thought the women would do better in the detailed work, yeah. Somebody that knew how to run it come over and give you a little instruction, and then you learned the hard way usually. My Lockheed job was, there were only 2 girls, the rest of them were all men. And the men kept changing because they kept being called to duty. So they'd only last maybe some of them a week, some of them 2 months, but never any longer than that. Some of them were sure good too. And they were perfectly fearless as far as the electrical equipment went, and the women were kind of scary of that. They had big wires that went across the tops of the tables, or the benches as they called them. And they had wires that dangled down, and you'd connect your tool to the wire and work from, you had electric, what do you call it? All kinds of electrical tools that you could get out of the tool crib just for the day. Gee, I hadn't thought about it. The timekeeper would come around and give you your jobs for the day, and sometimes they'd last 8 hours, and sometimes they'd only last 2 or 3. You'd get 2 or 3 jobs before the day was over. And then they'd try different things to see if it would improve your output. Like sometimes they'd come around with a big tray that had chewing gum on it. Be all different kinds of chewing gum, and you could take as many sticks as you wanted. You're supposed to chew it, and then they'd come around about 10 minutes later and you spit it out. And another time they gave you glasses of orange juice. And another time they gave you different things like that to test to see if it upped your output. Apparently it didn't much because they never ever repeated the same thing. And that's when they started having coffee breaks, that's right. They found out that that did help. So they kept up the coffee breaks. Forgotten that we hadn't had coffee breaks at all at first. Every once in a while you'd hear the elevator shoot up real fast and somebody come running over, somebody get their finger caught in the wheels, or there were quite a few accidents. Most of them weren't very bad, but some of them were pretty scary. You met some interesting people. It seemed like everybody was just, it was so fleeting, the people you'd meet. They'd just come in and be there a week or 2 and be gone. Never got very well acquainted with anybody. And they just kind of, like it was a holding station. Sometimes they'd be there a week, sometimes they'd be there a couple of months, but they'd take them from there and send them overseas. They never knew where they were going to be sent. There for a while they could go to Japan or to Europe, and they never knew which area they would go to. And we never knew because we never heard from them again. Mostly what I did was just working with electric tools on small parts, drilling holes. You put it in a big template and take a sort of a wax crayon and outline it. Then you take it over to a great big buzz saw and cut it. That was scary. I was scared to death when I had to work on the great big saw. You had to stand up to them. They're big saws that were whirling around. You had to put the parts through and cut just follow a little scratch on the piece of metal. Then you take it and finish it off with 2 or 3 different sizes of rat tail files to get in the corners, and different kinds of sandpaper, and finish it till it was smooth enough to use. And then they toss it on the side when it was done, and then a timekeeper would come around, see how many of them you'd gotten done in a period of time. You were supposed to, he'd tell you how many was expected, and you tried to keep pretty much within that limit. We were very lucky. We had a very good timekeeper, had a good sense of humor, and he was always had a joke to tell us when he came around. We were very lucky. He was a good man. He was a 4F, so he was a timekeeper almost the whole time. We were supposed to wear nets on our hair. The girls hated that, but they finally just decided it wasn't necessary. But we were supposed to be. They gave you a list of what you were supposed to, how you were supposed to dress. I wish I'd kept it. First time I ever wore slacks was when we worked at Lockheed. Women didn't do that as a general rule. Then you wore skirts. And I got my first pair of pants. I hated it. You weren't allowed to wear a watch, and I carried a regular, like a man's watch, only a small one. And we had to go out and get a toolbox, and they told us the size and the kind to get, and we had to buy our own tools. You worked weekends if you would. You were asked to work. Sometimes they'd go weeks without any time off at all. But I usually took a day off in the weekends because I had to get the washing done and things like that. You just did what you had to do. I don't remember being particularly impressed. The whole idea was to get the war over. Everybody was pretty excited. Boy, that night, gosh. We rode down the middle of the street. Everybody was screaming and yelling, and gosh, I never saw so much excitement. We went over to Hollywood down Sunset Boulevard. Just jam-packed. Everybody was so glad to have that war over with. Next day, my children, they were, 2 and 4, sitting on the front porch waiting and waiting. I said, "What are you waiting for, honey?" They said, "The war is over." And you said Daddy would come home when the war was over. We expected him the next day.